The Mojave Desert did not forgive mistakes. It did not forgive wrong turns, empty radiators, or the particular kind of pride that made a man believe he could outrun his enemies through 40 miles of black highway with 2 bullets already buried in his side. It did not forgive weakness, and it did not forgive the assumption that the darkness stretching out beyond the asphalt was empty. But on the night of October 14th, 1998, the desert made no judgment about an 8-year-old girl creeping through its cold shadows toward a dying man. The desert simply watched, and the wind, sharp and indifferent as a blade, moved through the creosote bushes and rattled the corrugated tin roof of a rotting barn and carried the smell of blood and gasoline out across the flats like a warning nobody had asked for. Harper Wren had been awake for 2 hours before the sound came. This was not unusual. Sleep in Marge Stokes's house was a negotiation, not a guarantee. You learned quickly that the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning were the only hours that truly belonged to you. The only stretch of time when Marge's heavy footsteps did not move down the hallway, when the back of her hand was not a possibility, when the air inside the cramped farmhouse did not carry that particular charge of impending cruelty that Harper had learned to read the way other children read weather. Marge Stokes had a gift for making the air in a room feel dangerous before she even entered it. Harper had learned to track that gift the way a sailor tracked the pressure drop before a storm. So Harper was awake, sitting on her favorite pile of hay in the far corner of the barn, wrapped in a moving blanket she had rescued from the trash pile behind the house 3 months ago. It was gray and threadbare and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was hers in the way that almost nothing else in her life was hers. She had a composition notebook, too, tucked under the hay where Marge would never think to look. Half its pages were filled with Harper's small, careful handwriting. Observations, details, the color of the sky at different times of night, the names of the stars she had taught herself from a library book she'd borrowed and never returned, because returning it would have required Marge to drive her to town, and Marge rarely drove anywhere that did not benefit Marge directly. Harper Wren was 8 years old. She had lived in 4 different foster placements in the 3 years since the state of California had taken her from a hospital waiting room where she had been found alone at age 5. No parents, no note, no explanation that anyone had ever shared with her. She had learned in those 3 years that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people: people who noticed things and people who did not. Harper had decided very early that she would be the kind who noticed. She noticed, for instance, that the barn's west wall had a gap between 2 planks wide enough to press her eye against and see a clean wedge of the highway and the long dirt road that cut off it and wound past Marge's property. She noticed that on clear nights the headlights of passing trucks swept across the ceiling of the barn in long yellow arcs. She noticed that the desert at midnight made a very specific kind of silence, a silence with texture and layers: the distant yip of coyotes, the dry scrape of tumbleweeds against fence wire, the rhythm of the wind rising and falling like something breathing. She noticed at 12 minutes past midnight that the silence changed. It did not change gradually. It changed the way a window changes when something is thrown through it. A sound arrived from the direction of the highway that was not wind and not coyote, and not the familiar low moan of a passing semi. It was sharp and flat and came in 2 quick bursts, separated by less than a second. And Harper, who had never heard a gunshot fired outside of the television set in Marge's living room, knew immediately and without question what she was hearing. She pressed her eye to the gap in the barn wall. 2 headlights were visible on the highway, moving fast, too fast for the curve that bent the road around the base of a low ridge about a quarter-mile out. Behind them, gaining, were 2 more sets of headlights running without the gap that polite traffic maintained, riding close and aggressive in a way that made Harper's stomach tighten even from this distance. The pursuing lights moved with intent. There was nothing accidental about the way they tracked the lights in front. The front headlights hit the curve. One of them made it. The other did not. She watched the single remaining light leave the road. It arced sideways into the desert scrub, sweeping wildly across the dark landscape like a searchlight, knocked off its mount. And then there was a sound that she felt as much as heard: a deep percussive crash of metal and earth, and something dense and heavy hitting the ground, followed by a long, scraping shriek of chrome across gravel, And then silence came back down over everything like a door being shut. The two pursuing headlights slowed on the highway. They idled for a moment, their engines audible even at this distance, a low, patient rumble. Then slowly they moved on, disappearing around the far bend of the road and not returning. Harper did not move for a long time. She sat with her eyes still pressed to the gap in the barn wall, and she breathed carefully and she thought. Every practical instinct she had developed across 4 foster placements told her to stay where she was. Loud noises in the night meant danger. Danger meant stillness and silence and invisibility. She was good at all three. She had needed to be. But from somewhere out in the dark near the ditch that ran along the edge of Marge's property, a sound reached her. Low, ragged, not mechanical, human. It was the sound of a person trying to breathe through pain so severe that breathing had become a deliberate act of will. Harper had made that sound herself 3 weeks ago when Marge had shoved her into the kitchen counter hard enough to crack 2 ribs on her left side. She knew what it meant. It meant someone was hurt badly enough that pride had stopped being an option. She was out of the barn before she had consciously decided to move. The cold hit her immediately. October nights in the Mojave dropped fast and hard, and she was wearing only the oversized nightgown she'd been given by the last foster family, a faded yellow thing that hung past her knees and did nothing against the wind. Her feet were bare. The dirt was cold enough to ache against her soles, each step registering as a small, precise discomfort that she filed away and ignored. She moved in a low crouch along the fence line, keeping to the shadow of the posts, watching the highway in case those 2 sets of headlights came back. They did not. The night stayed empty and dark except for the spray of stars overhead, brilliant and cold and infinite above the desert floor. She found the wreckage in the ditch. The motorcycle was enormous, even mangled, even with its front fork bent entirely backward, and its chrome scraped down to raw metal, and its fuel tank cracked and weeping a dark stain into the thirsty dirt. It was clearly a machine of considerable power and purpose. Custom built, she would learn later. A Harley-Davidson chopper that had cost more than most cars, now reduced to a heap of twisted metal and shattered glass that caught the moonlight in cold fragments. The man lay a few feet beyond it, half buried in the tumbleweeds and loose gravel, and he was the largest human being Harper Wren had ever seen in her life. She stopped at the edge of the ditch and looked at him. He was on his side, his massive back toward her, and even in the moonlight, she could read the leather vest he wore, the cut, with its insignia stitched in careful detail across the back. The winged skull, the curved lettering of the top rocker, Hell's Angels, the bottom rocker below it, San Bernardino. Harper had heard of the Hell's Angels. Marge talked about bikers the way she talked about everything she feared and did not understand, with contempt and exaggerated disgust, calling them criminals and animals and men who deserved whatever happened to them. Mrs. Pulaski at school had told a story once about how the bikers rode through town on the 4th of July and everyone locked their doors and kept their children inside. Harper looked at the man in the ditch. His chest was moving, barely but moving. She climbed down. The smell reached her before she got close enough to see clearly. Blood had its own smell, something Harper recognized from her own split lips and scraped knees and the night 3 weeks ago with the kitchen counter. But this was different in scale, heavy and metallic and warm in the cold air, mixing with the gasoline and burnt rubber in a way that made her eyes water and her throat tighten. He had been shot twice in the right side, just below his ribs. His flannel shirt was saturated dark and wet, and the leather vest over it was black with blood. His right hand was pressed flat against the wounds, with the desperate, instinctive pressure of a man who understood at some animal level that he was leaking and that leaking had to be stopped. His breathing was shallow and rapid and carried a wet quality that frightened her in a way that the dark and the cold in the distance from the house did not. Harper looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she turned and ran back toward the house. The kitchen window was the one Marge never latched properly because the latch had broken 2 years ago and Marge had never gotten around to fixing it. Harper had known this for 6 weeks. She had filed it away the way she filed everything away as a piece of information that existed in a category she mentally labeled things that might one day be useful. She slid the window up, pulled herself through the frame, navigated the cluttered sink with practiced silence, and landed on the kitchen linoleum without a sound. The house was dark and still. From down the hall came the familiar rumble of Marge's snoring, that ragged, grinding rhythm that Harper had learned to track the way sailors tracked weather. As long as the snoring continued, she was safe. She went to the bathroom first. The medicine cabinet behind the mirror held Marge's personal supplies, things she bought for herself and kept carefully inventoried because Marge Stokes ran a precise and self-interested household where the distribution of resources followed a single clear principle. There were 2 brown bottles of hydrogen peroxide, a roll of gauze bandaging, medical tape, the white cloth kind that stuck reliably to skin, a pair of scissors with orange handles. Harper took all of it. From the hallway closet, she took 3 white hand towels, the older ones with the fraying edges that Marge would be slower to notice missing. She bundled everything under her arm, navigated back through the kitchen, and was out the window and running across the desert floor before she had time to consider what she was doing or why. She did not stop to consider it. She already knew why. The why was not complicated. Something was hurt and alone in the dark, and she knew what that felt like. And she was the only one who had found it, and that meant she was the only one who could do anything about it. It was the same logic that had always governed the most important decisions of her short life. Clean and simple and without room for argument. She slid back down into the ditch beside the man. He had not moved. His breathing was worse. She uncapped the first bottle of hydrogen peroxide and then she paused. Not from fear, from a practical question. She needed to see what she was working with before she could work with it. The moonlight was adequate, but barely. She studied the configuration of his body, identified the location of his hand pressing against his side, noted the spread of the blood stain and the approximate position of the wounds beneath. She had read about pressure and wounds in a first aid book she had found in the school library, the kind of book nobody else checked out. And she had read it with the focused attention she gave to everything that might one day matter. She had not known reading it why she was reading it. She understood now that some knowledge arranged itself in you before it told you what it was for. She needed to lift his hand to access the wound site. She needed to clean and pack and create pressure that would hold. She leaned over him and said quietly but clearly, in the voice she used when she needed to be heard without triggering alarm, "I'm going to help you. Don't move fast." He moved fast. The hand that came off his wound and closed around her wrist was extraordinary in its speed and force, a reflex so deeply embedded it had survived blood loss and shock and the edge of unconsciousness, and it closed on her thin wrist with a grip that would leave its own bruises by morning. His eyes came open, dark and wild and unfocused, sweeping the darkness for a threat with the trained urgency of a man who had spent decades understanding that threats arrive without announcement. Harper did not flinch. She did not pull away. She stayed exactly where she was, her knees in the cold dirt, and she looked directly into his eyes and waited for them to find her. They found her. The grip on her wrist did not release immediately, but she felt the quality of it change, felt the aggression in it recalibrate towards something confused and uncertain as his brain worked through what his eyes were reporting. He was staring at an 8-year-old girl in a faded yellow nightgown, with bare feet and a bundle of stolen medical supplies tucked under one arm. The grip loosened. His hand fell back into the dirt. "You're leaking," Harper told him. She kept her voice factual and calm, giving nothing for the situation to grab onto and escalate. "I need to look at it and slow it down or you'll go away." The man stared at her. His face in the moonlight was broad and heavily weathered, framed by a dark beard going gray at the jaw, and it was the color of old ash beneath the tan. His eyes, now that they had settled, were dark and deep-set, and currently doing the work of a man trying to understand how he had arrived at this particular moment. "Kid," he said. His voice sounded like gravel being dragged across a metal plate. "Run, bad men, coming back." "I saw them leave," Harper said. She was already uncapping the hydrogen peroxide. "They went the other direction. Hold still, this is going to bite." She poured the peroxide directly into the first wound. The sound he made was not a scream. It was something more compressed and more terrible than a scream. A sound that came up from somewhere deep in his chest and was suppressed through what appeared to be an enormous and costly act of will. His jaw clenched, his massive body arching off the ground, his free hand driving into the gravel and squeezing until she could hear the stones grinding. A sound that acknowledged the pain completely without surrendering to it. Harper did not flinch at the sound. She had heard sounds like it before, though, from smaller people in smaller rooms. She watched him the way she watched Marge during unpredictable moments, reading the body for information. And when she judged the peroxide had done what it needed to do, she folded one of the white towels into a tight, firm square and pressed it against the wound site, with both hands putting her full weight behind it. "Hold this," she said. He pressed his massive hand over hers, and she pulled her hands free and let him take over the pressure while she worked the scissors through his flannel shirt, cutting up the side. The cold desert air hit his exposed skin, and he shuddered violently, a full-body tremor that moved through him like a wave and subsided. She worked the gauze around his torso, passing it under his back over the packed towel, pulling it as tight as her small arms could manage. She used the full roll without hesitation. Then she sealed it with the medical tape, pressing the edges down firmly, running her thumb along each edge to test the hold. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she had done. It was not surgical, but the bleeding had visibly slowed. The towel was darkening, but not saturating at the rate it had been before she'd applied the pressure. She had bought him time. She understood clearly that this was all she had done. Time was not salvation. Time was just more of itself, and what he did with it was beyond her ability to control. He was watching her. He had been watching her work with an expression she could not entirely name, something between disbelief and a quality she would only have a word for years later. She did not try to name it now. She filed it and moved on. "What's your name?" he asked. His breathing had not improved, but it had steadied into something more regular. "Harper," she said. "What's yours?" "Dylan," he said. "People call me Kodiak." She nodded, accepting this without elaboration. "Kodiak, there's a payphone at the gas station down the highway, the abandoned one with the red sign. I've seen it when Marge drives to town. It's about a quarter-mile from here." She paused, calculating. "Can you walk a quarter-mile?" He looked at her for a moment, as if the question required assessment rather than simple answer. "Yeah," he said. "I can walk a quarter-mile." "Then you need to go soon. Marge wakes up at 6. If she finds you here, she'll call the police." Harper paused. "And if she finds out I took her towels and her tape, she'll put me in the darkroom." She said it the way she said most things, as a statement of fact rather than a complaint, and she watched the change that moved across his face when he processed it. Something tightened along his jaw. His eyes, which had been dimming at the edges with blood loss and the weight of pain, sharpened suddenly, and she saw him look at her collarbone, where her nightgown had slipped, and she saw him see what was there, because she had seen it herself in the bathroom mirror. The yellow-green remains of bruising that mapped 4 individual fingers and a thumb with the precision of a signature. "Who did that to you?" he said. "I fell," Harper said immediately. The response was automatic, installed by repetition. "No, you didn't," he said. She did not answer that. She pulled her collar up with one hand. He reached into the inner pocket of his leather vest with the slow deliberateness of a man navigating pain and produced something heavy that caught the moonlight when it cleared the fabric. A medallion on a thick chain, solid silver, bearing the crest of his chapter in raised detail. The winged skull, the charter name arcing above it. He held it out toward her. "Take this," he said. She looked at it without touching it. "Why?" "Because I'm telling you to." He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it with his own. His hand was enormous around hers. "You keep it hidden. You remember my name. Kodiak. You remember I owe you a life." He looked directly at her, and the intensity of it was something she felt physically, a pressure behind her sternum. "I don't forget my debts. Do you understand that?" Harper looked down at the silver in her hand. It was heavy and warm from being against his body, and the raised detail of the winged skull pressed into her palm with a clarity that would leave a temporary mark. "Okay," she said. She reached into the pocket of her nightgown, where she kept her composition notebook and a stub of pencil, because she carried them everywhere the way other children carried comfort objects or lucky stones. She tore a page from the back of the notebook carefully along the binding. She wrote the address of Marge's property, the number from the rural route marker she had memorized months ago, because she memorized such things as a matter of practice, and the highway number. She folded the page twice and pushed it into the breast pocket of his cut, the inside pocket, the same one from which he had taken the medallion. He looked down at this pocket, then he looked at her face. "In case you forget," she said, simply, without apology or explanation. Something moved across his face that she filed away without naming. She would name it years later, sitting in a courthouse hallway with the silver worm in her palm. The word would come to her out of a dictionary she had read at age 9 because she read everything available. Undone. It was the precise expression of a man being very quietly and completely undone by something he had not prepared for. With an effort that was extraordinary to witness Dylan Briggs, who rode as Kodiak, who was sergeant-at-arms for the San Bernardino chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, and who had been shot twice and had ridden 40 miles through the desert dark on the wrong side of consciousness, to arrive at this ditch rolled onto his knees. He rose in stages, each stage its own negotiation to his full height. Standing, he was immense. 6 feet 4 inches of heavily built man, the desert wind moving his open flannel away from the white bandages wrapped tight around his torso. He looked down at her for a moment from that height. "Go back to bed, Harper," he said. "Get inside before it gets light." She nodded. She watched him walk. Each step was a controlled and separate act of will. His body and his intention in constant negotiation, his hand pressed against his bandaged side. She watched until the darkness of the desert swallowed him completely, and there was nothing left to watch. Then she went back to the barn, buried the bloody rags and the empty peroxide bottle in the loose soil near the fence post, tamping the earth down with her bare foot until the surface looked undisturbed, and crept back through the kitchen window. She was in her bed with the medallion pressed flat against her sternum under her nightgown before the first gray light touched the horizon. She lay in the dark and did not sleep. She listened to the desert wind against the walls, and to the sound of her own heartbeat, and to the faint, very distant rumble that might have been a vehicle on the highway, or might have been something else entirely. She thought about the man making his way through the dark toward a payphone a quarter-mile away. She thought about whether a quarter-mile was too far given the volume of blood she had seen before the pressure dressing took hold. She thought about the folded piece of paper she had pressed into his pocket. She had not asked herself in the moment of doing it why she was doing it. She had done it the way she did most things that mattered, on a clear-eyed instinct that moved faster than conscious reasoning. If he survived, he would need to know where to find her. If he did not survive, the piece of paper would not matter to anyone. She thought he would survive. She had worked the gauze as tight as her arms could manage, and the towel had been holding when he stood up. She thought he was the kind of man who survived things that would finish other men not from luck, but from the specific quality of will she had watched him apply to the problem of standing up. She lay in the gray hours before dawn and turned the question over with the methodical attention she gave to everything that puzzled her, and eventually she arrived at the most accurate answer she could construct. She had put the address in his pocket because she was 8 years old, and she had been alone for as long as she could remember, and she had just spent 20 minutes in the dark with someone who had looked at her, actually looked at her, used her name, noticed what was wrong without being told. She had wanted in some way she could not have put into adequate words to leave a door open. She closed her eyes. At 7 in the morning, the house shook with Marge Stokes's fury. Harper heard it building before it arrived at her door. The crash of the medicine cabinet being shut with force, the bang of the linen closet, the heavy footsteps coming fast and irregular down the hall, the particular rhythm of Marge's anger, and Harper had time to close her fingers around the medallion beneath her nightgown before the bedroom door opened hard enough to strike the wall. Marge Stokes was a large woman with small, pale eyes and a face that seemed to carry a permanent grievance against the world that had given her less than she felt she deserved. When she was angry, she moved with a righteous total energy that filled whatever room she entered and left no space for anything else. She crossed the bedroom in 3 strides and had Harper by the arm before Harper had fully sat upright, hauling her off the mattress with a grip that wrenched her shoulder socket. "Where are my towels?" Marge said. Her voice was very quiet, which was worse than shouting. "Where is my tape? Where is my peroxide?" Harper said nothing. "You little thief!" The back of Marge's hand connected with the side of Harper's face, snapping her head to the side. Harper tasted blood from the inside of her cheek, where it had caught against her teeth. She did not fall because Marge still had her arm. "Who were you stealing for? Who was out there last night?" Harper said nothing. Marge looked at her with those small, pale eyes, and whatever she saw in Harper's face, that particular blankness that Harper had developed as a survival mechanism across 4 placements in 3 years, seemed to enrage her more than any response would have. "You can tell me," Marge said, "or you can tell the darkroom." She dragged Harper down the hallway by her arm. The basement door was at the far end, heavy wood with a deadbolt mounted on the outside, which was not where deadbolts were supposed to be on interior doors, and which Harper had understood from the first time she saw it as a statement of intent. Marge threw the door open with one hand and shoved Harper through the frame. Harper caught the railing and managed the first 2 steps before the door slammed behind her, and the deadbolt drove home with a sound like punctuation at the end of a sentence that allowed no reply. Darkness, complete and absolute, the kind that had physical weight that pressed against the eyes. Harper sat on the second step with her back against the railing and breathed slowly and carefully, counting her breaths until her heartbeat settled. This was not the first time she had been in the basement. She knew its dimensions from memory. She knew the cold smell of it, concrete and damp and old wood. She knew that it was not dangerous, merely dark, and that darkness was a condition rather than a threat. She had told herself this before and found it to be reliably true. She reached under her nightgown and closed her hand around the medallion. Heavy, still warm from her own body heat. The raised detail of the winged skull pressed into her palm with that same clarity she had felt in the ditch. She thought about this gas station, the payphone with the faded red sign, a quarter-mile of dark desert. She had watched him stand. She had watched him take those first steps with the deliberate, controlled weight of a man who understood exactly what each step cost and had decided the cost was acceptable. The bandaging had been holding when he walked away from her. She thought about the address on the folded piece of paper tucked into the inside pocket of his cut. Above her, through the heavy door in the floor, the house resumed its ordinary morning sounds. The television in the living room, the kettle, the drag of Marge's chair across the kitchen linoleum, the sounds of a household that had decided to proceed as normal. Harper sat in the dark and held the silver and did not cry. Sometime later, she heard sounds that did not belong to the ordinary morning. A vehicle slowing on the highway, the sound of tires on the gravel drive moving slowly, the particular sound of car doors opening and closing with the deliberate quiet of people who did not want to announce themselves. She pressed herself against the railing and listened with the full attention she brought to things that mattered. She heard the front door of the house open without a knock. She heard Marge's voice, surprised and then alarmed. She heard another voicemail, cold, asking something she could not make out through the floor. She heard Marge's voice climb in pitch. She heard clearly enough to understand the word basement. Harper looked at the door at the top of the stairs. She looked at the darkness pooling below her at the bottom of the steps. She pressed the medallion flat against her chest beneath the nightgown. Far away, so faint it might have been the sound of her own blood moving in her ears, a vibration came through the desert floor. Not a single engine. Something composed of many engines running in formation. A resonance that built from barely perceptible to undeniable with the slow inevitability of a tide coming in. It moved through the concrete of the basement floor and through the wooden stairs and into her where she sat. Harper Wren closed her eyes. Above her, heavy boots moved across the kitchen floor toward the basement door. She heard them stop. She heard a hand touch the wood. She whispered to the medallion in her hand, to the folded piece of paper she had pressed into a pocket in the dark, to no one and to everything. He has the paper. He knows where I am. The vibration in the ground grew until it was no longer a vibration, but a sound, no longer a sound, but a physical condition of the morning air. The boots at the door stopped moving. The payphone at the abandoned Reyes gas station on Highway 15 had not been used in 11 months. The line was still active, maintained by the indifferent machinery of a billing system that charged the absent property owner $32 each month for a service nobody was using. The handset hung in its cradle behind a cracked plastic housing printed with an advertisement for a calling card company that had gone out of business in 1996. The desert had done what the desert did to everything left unattended, bleached it and dried it, and worked patiently at its edges. At 12:47 in the morning on October 15, 1998, the phone rang for the first time in nearly a year. It rang once. The man who answered was named Curtis Briggs, and he was Kodiak's younger brother by 4 years, and he had been sitting awake in the San Bernardino clubhouse for the past 2 hours, because Kodiak had not come back from the run, and Kodiak always came back. In 22 years of riding with his brother Curtis, had developed an accurate sense of when Kodiak's absence was ordinary and when it was something else. Tonight's silence had a quality that had kept him upright and awake with a cup of cold coffee and a feeling in his chest like a fist slowly tightening around something that mattered. He had the hand set to his ear before the first ring finished. What came through the line was not a voice in the usual sense. It was a controlled exhalation, the sound of a man who had marshaled everything he had left toward the single purpose of forming words. "Curtis," Kodiak said. "Payphone, Reyes Station. Come now. Come quiet." The line went dead. Curtis Briggs was already moving before the echo of the click faded. By the time the truck reached the gas station, Kodiak was on the ground beside the phone booth, his back against the concrete block wall, his legs extended straight in front of him, one hand maintaining pressure against his bandaged side. He had made the quarter mile on will alone. Each step had been its own separate negotiation between his body and his intention, and when his legs finally reached their limit, he had chosen his position deliberately, sitting rather than falling, his back against something solid, his hand where it needed to be. Curtis came out of the truck fast and crouched in front of him, and the first thing he saw before he saw the pallor or the sweat or the depth of the exhaustion in his brother's face was the bandaging. White gauze wrapped multiple times around Kodiak's torso, already darkening at the wound site, but holding its position sealed with medical tape that had been applied with deliberate pressure. The work of someone who had understood what they were doing and had done it with care. "Who wrapped you?" Curtis said. "Tell you later," Kodiak said. "Get me to Callum, now." Curtis got him to the truck without further questions. Kodiak did not make a sound on the drive, not because he was unconscious, but because he was using every available resource to stay conscious. His jaw set against the pain, his eyes fixed on the passing highway with the focused attention of a man who understood that the moment he stopped attending to the task at hand, he would lose the thread entirely. The San Bernardino clubhouse at 2 in the morning was quieter than it was at 2 in the afternoon. But it was never empty because men who lived the way these men lived rarely slept without difficulty in the small hours. And there were always those awake playing cards at the long table in the main hall, working on bikes in the garage bay, watching the front door with the patient vigilance of people who understood that threats rarely announced themselves in advance. When Curtis came through with Kodiak's arm across his shoulders, the quiet ended. Within 4 minutes, Raymond Coulter was standing in the doorway of the main hall. He was called Iron Wall by everyone who rode with him, and the name had been earned across 30 years of decisions made under pressure, in circumstances that would have broken men without the particular combination of qualities he possessed. He was 53 years old, built like something quarried rather than grown, with iron gray hair cropped close to his skull, and pale eyes so steady and unrevealing that they made people who weren't accustomed to them profoundly uncomfortable. He had been president of the San Bernardino Charter for 11 years. He had, in those 11 years, seen most things at least twice, and had developed an accurate sense of when something was outside the ordinary range of bad. He stood in the doorway and looked at his sergeant-at-arms being held upright by Curtis Briggs, and his face did not change, but something behind his pale eyes went very still, in a way the men around him recognized and took seriously. "Get Callum," he said. Callum Reeves had been asleep on the couch in the back room, which was where he slept when he stayed at the clubhouse because the house 12 miles away that he'd lived in alone for 7 years had become increasingly difficult to inhabit in the small hours. He was 51, lean and gray-bearded, with hands whose steadiness was their most remarkable quality, and a face that had learned across 2 combat deployments to reveal as little as possible. Before he earned his patch, he had been a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and the things he had seen and done in that capacity had permanently revised his understanding of what human bodies could survive and what they could not. He was awake and moving before anyone finished saying his name. They put Kodiak on the pool table. This was practical rather than ceremonial. The felt surface was firm and flat and at the right working height, and it was a surface that could be cleaned afterward. Callum worked in the overhead light that a prospect had repositioned from above the bar, moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had performed similar work in conditions considerably worse than a clubhouse in San Bernardino. He cut away the remains of Kodiak's flannel shirt. He examined the bandaging without touching it, yet his eyes moving over the gauze and tape with a professional attention that was separate from the urgency of the situation, reading the quality of the work, the way a craftsman reads another craftsman's output. He was quiet for a moment. "Hold him," he said. 3 men put their weight across Kodiak's shoulders and legs. What followed was not quick and could not be gentle, because gentleness was not available in the circumstances. And Kodiak endured it with his teeth clenched around a folded leather belt that someone pressed into his mouth at the right moment, his body rigid with the tremendous effort of not fighting what was being done to it, his eyes fixed on a point on the ceiling and staying there. Raymond Coulter stood at the head of the table throughout and did not speak and did not look away. When Callum had done what needed doing and was covering the closed wounds with fresh bandaging, Ironwall looked at Kodiak's face and waited for his eyes to come back from wherever they had gone. "Ambush," Ironwall said. It was not framed as a question. "Tunnel Road," Kodiak said. His voice was rough and spent, dragged over the gravel of what the last several hours had cost him. 2 bikes, they were set and waiting. He breathed carefully. "Fletcher Hade's crew. I made the second one. Rode Victorville before Hade picked him up." Ironwall received this information the way he received most information, completely and without visible reaction, filing it for the appropriate consideration at the appropriate time. "The bandaging," Callum said. He was still working, not looking up. "Who did this?" Kodiak looked at the ceiling. A long pause, the kind that was not delay but preparation. 8-year-old girl," he said. The room went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. Not shock exactly, something more like recalibration. The men gathered around the pool table adjusted the frame of what they were looking at to accommodate information that did not fit the previous frame. "A kid," Curtis said from the edge of the room. "Out there. Farm property off Highway 15, Kodiak said. "Outside Basto. Foster situation. Woman named Marge Stokes runs the place." He stopped. He looked at his hands resting at his sides. Kid had bruises on her collarbone, the shape of fingers, ribs showing through her nightgown. He looked at Ironwall. "She said if Marge found out she'd taken the medical supplies, she'd be put in the dark room. Said it like she was telling me the weather. Just a fact, just a regular thing." The silence in the room changed quality again. Ironwall looked at the men around the table. He saw in their faces what he expected to see, what he would have seen in his own face, if he could have looked at it from the outside. He looked back at Kodiak. "There's more," Ironwall said. He said it without inflection, reading something in Kodiak's face that was still being held back. Kodiak was quiet for a long moment. Nobody in the room moved or spoke. "She put her address in my pocket," he said. "Tore a page out of her notebook while I was still on the ground. Wrote the address and the highway number and pushed it into my cut before I left." He paused. "She didn't ask me to come back. She just made sure I had what I needed to find her if I decided to." He reached into the cut draped across the end of the pool table and produced the folded piece of paper. He held it without opening it, just held it in his fingers. "I gave her my medallion," Kodiak said. The room absorbed this. Every man present understood the weight of what he'd just heard. The charter medallion was not jewelry. It was not a decorative object. It was a thing of specific and serious significance, and the act of giving it away was not casual, and was not accidental, and was not done lightly. Ironwall looked at the folded paper in Kodiak's hand, then at Kodiak's face. "Why?" he said. Dylan Briggs had ridden 40 miles through the Mojave with 2 bullets in his side and a folded piece of paper in his pocket, and a debt he had already somewhere on that dark highway decided he was going to repay. He looked at the president of his chapter. "Because I owed her a life," he said, "and because she had Emma's eyes." He said it in the same register as everything else. The low gravel voice, the controlled delivery. But every man in the room heard it, and every man in the room understood the precise weight of what it cost him to say it in this room in front of these men. Emma Briggs had been 5 years old in March of 1993 when a drunk driver crossed the center line on a Tuesday afternoon on a road in Fontana, California. The world had divided at that moment into the part that came before and the part that came after. And in the 5 years since Kodiak had not spoken his daughter's name inside this building or in front of these men, they knew. The way men who live in close shared quarters and share danger know things about each other that are never said directly. But knowing and being told were entirely different things, and the room understood it was receiving something that had been held back for 5 years through considerable effort. Ironwall looked at his sergeant-at-arms for a long time. Then he looked around the room, making brief eye contact with the men gathered there. "Get everyone up," he said quietly. "Every man who can ride." He turned to Elliot Branson, who had come in from the back hallway, still pulling his shirt straight, a man of 45 who wore well-made clothing on a frame that suggested he had not always been a lawyer who kept a restored 1971 Sportster in the club garage, and who handled the chapter's legal affairs with a fierce and creative intelligence that had proved its value on more than one occasion. "You're with me," Ironwall said. "Already working it," Elliot said. Men who have ridden together for years do not confuse urgency with disorder. Within 20 minutes, 40 motorcycles were warming in the lot behind the clubhouse, their exhaust notes climbing together into the cold October morning air, a sound that built from individual voices into something collective and purposeful. Kodiak was on his feet. His torso was freshly wrapped, his color still wrong, his movements careful and deliberate. Callum had made his position clear. Callum's position was ignored in the respectful but absolute way that such positions were always ignored when Kodiak had made a decision. "You're not riding," Curtis said. "I'm riding," Kodiak said. Curtis looked at Ironwall. Ironwall looked at Kodiak for a moment, reading something in the set of his brother's face and his jaw, and then nodded once. Kodiak rode. 20 miles away in a farmhouse outside Basto, California, the morning had gone wrong in the specific way that mornings go wrong when the wrong people arrive at them. Fletcher Haydes' men came at 7:40, 3 of them in a black Suburban with Nevada plates, men in their 30s, who moved with the particular economy of people who had made violence a professional practice. Fletcher Hyde himself was not present, which was consistent with the discipline that had kept him operating successfully in the margins of San Bernardino County for 8 years without accumulating the kind of legal exposure that ended operations. The man in front was named Doyle. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to his chin and eyes the flat gray of old concrete. He kicked the front door of Marge Stokes's house without knocking, because knocking was a courtesy the situation did not require. Marge was in her kitchen with her coffee mug in front of her, and she sat very still while Doyle told her what he was looking for. He was concise and unhurried about it, which was more frightening than urgency would have been. Marge told him she did not know anything about any biker. Doyle told her about the bandaging he had found evidence of, the bloody rags buried near the fence post, the empty hydrogen peroxide bottles. He described these findings without accusation as plain information that had led him to this kitchen and that required explanation. Marge did the arithmetic quickly. She weighed her options and found them narrow, and she arrived at the one that seemed most likely to keep her physically intact, which was to redirect the problem toward the person in her house least equipped to protect herself from its consequences. The girl, she said. Harper. I locked her in the basement this morning. She must have stolen the supplies last night. She's the one who helped whoever it was. A pause. I didn't know anything about it. Doyle looked at her for a moment without expression. Then he looked at the hallway. Show me, he said. Marge walked him to the basement door and pointed at the deadbolt. Doyle reached for it. His hand did not reach the lock. The sound arrived first as a low-frequency tremor that moved through the farmhouse floor and rattled the dishes in the kitchen cabinet and made the overhead light sway on its chain. Then it became audible above the noise threshold, a layered mechanical roar that grew from distant to close with the speed of something that was moving very fast and had a great deal of mass behind it. It grew until it was not background noise but the entire foreground, until it was not a sound but a physical condition of the air itself. Doyle went to the living room window and put 2 fingers in the blinds. The lead bikes were already turning off the highway onto the dirt road, and the dust they raised was a wall, a churning red-brown tower that rose 30 feet and kept climbing as more bikes followed through the turn. The chrome caught the low October sun and threw fragments of light across the desert scrub in all directions. The sound was no longer something heard through ears, but something felt in the chest cavity and the back of the throat. 40 Hell's Angels came down that dirt road with the unhurried certainty of weather arriving. Doyle stepped back from the window. He looked at his 2 men. What happened in the following 90 seconds was not a fight in any meaningful sense. A fight requires some equivalence of position, some genuine contest. What happened was a tide meeting 3 rocks. The front windows came in, the door came off its frame. Men moved through every available opening with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this before in other locations and had learned from each iteration. And Doyle and his men found themselves completely overwhelmed before they had finished assessing what was happening to them. They were disarmed. They were subdued. They were dragged by their collars out into the dirt driveway and held there. And the morning air was full of ticking engines, cooling, and boots on gravel, and the silence that follows the end of a brief and decisive application of force. Ironwall came through the ruined doorway and walked across the broken glass without looking at it. Behind him, moving carefully but on his own feet, one hand pressed against his bandaged side, came Kodiak. Marge Stokes had backed herself into the corner where the kitchen counter met the refrigerator. Her arms wrapped around herself, her face a mask of terror that had erased whatever domestic authority she normally carried in this space. She looked at Ironwall. She looked at Kodiak. Recognition moved across her face when she saw him. Kodiak looked at her for a moment. Just looked. Then he turned and walked down the hall. He found the basement door by what it was, an interior door with a deadbolt on the outside, which was not where deadbolts belonged on interior doors, and the casual wrongness of it, the domesticated deliberateness of it, landed somewhere below conscious thought. He raised his boot and drove it through the door at the lock point. The wood gave with a single sharp crack. The door swung inward, bounced off the wall, and settled. In the darkness of the stairwell beyond it, rose up cold and close and absolute. Ironwall stood behind him in the hallway. Kodiak stood at the top of the stairs and looked down into the dark. Harper, he said. His voice in the narrow stairwell was different than it was in open space. Lower, more careful. The register you use when speaking into a space that held something that could be damaged by the wrong approach. From the bottom of the stairs, from the darkness, a voice came back. It was not the voice of a child who had been crying. It was steady and direct, the voice of a child who had been sitting in the dark, running through the available information, calculating probabilities, and arriving at conclusions, and who had just confirmed the conclusions she had been working toward. "Are you hurt?" she said. Kodiak stood at the top of the stairs, and the question moved through him like something with physical properties. "I'm all right," he said. A pause from the darkness below. A pause with weight in it, as if the answer were being evaluated against an internal standard before being accepted. Then he heard movement, small feet on the concrete floor, the soft complaint of the lowest stair under a slight weight, a shape appearing at the bottom of the stairwell looking up at the rectangle of hallway light above her. Harper Wren was the same girl she had been when she climbed back through the kitchen window before dawn. The yellow nightgown was dirty from the barn floor and the basement concrete. Her feet were bare. Her hair had come loose and tangled. There was dried blood at the corner of her mouth from where Marge's hand had connected that morning. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at Kodiak and Ironwall and the dim light behind them, and she did not run forward. She stood and she looked with the clear-eyed, measuring attention that was her most consistent quality. Then she opened her right hand. The silver medallion lay in her palm. She had been holding it the entire time she had been down here. The surface was warm from her skin. "I kept it hidden," she said. "Like you said." Kodiak went down the stairs. He was a large man in a narrow stairwell with fresh sutures in his side, and he went down those stairs with the focused care of someone who understood that the next minute was not about his pain or his injury or the events of the past 7 hours. He reached the bottom step and crouched in front of her, bringing his face level with hers. In the dim light from the doorway above, he could see the bruising clearly, the yellow-green marks on her collarbone, the older marks on her upper arm where fingers had gripped and held, the split at the corner of her lip. Harper looked at him steadily. She did not look away from his face. He reached out slowly and she did not flinch when his hand came toward her, which told him something specific and terrible about what she had learned to expect from hands that moved toward her face. He tucked a strand of dirty blonde hair back from her forehead. "I told you I don't forget debts," he said. "I know," she said. "Nobody is putting you in the dark again," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she held the medallion out toward him. "You should have it back," she said. Kodiak looked at the silver in her small hand. He looked at her face. "Hold on to it a little longer," he said. She considered this. Then she closed her fingers around it and nodded once, the decisive nod of someone who has accepted a reasonable arrangement. Kodiak stood and held out his hand, and Harper Wren took it, and they came up out of the basement together into the light of the hallway. In the living room, Ironwall looked at the girl. He looked at the bruising on her collarbone and her arms. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had made a decision and was now simply moving through its implications in sequence. Elliot Branson was already on his cell phone in the corner of the room, speaking quietly, and from the fragments audible over the noise of the men and machines filling the driveway outside, he was not speaking to anyone Marge Stokes would have chosen to call. Marge had not moved from her corner. She was watching Harper with an expression that was complicated in the way the faces of people caught in the mechanics of their own cruelty are complicated, a mixture of shame and resentment, and the particular outrage of someone who had believed themselves safe from consequences. Ironwall looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "We're not here to hurt you," he said. His voice was level and entirely without warmth. "What's going to happen is straightforward. The county sheriff is on his way. Child Protective Services is on their way. You're going to explain the lock on the outside of a basement door and the bruising on this child and the nature of your arrangement with the state of California regarding the children in your care." He paused. "We'll be here when they arrive, all 40 of us, as witnesses to the current state of this property and this child." Marge looked at the ruined front door. She looked at the motorcycles filling her driveway and the men standing among them in the morning light. She said nothing. Harper stood beside Kodiak in the living room and looked around at the men filling the space. Large men, heavily built, leather-clad, tattooed faces that had been shaped by decades of living in ways that did not resemble the way most people lived. She looked at them with the clear-eyed, measuring attention she brought to everything, taking inventory the way she always did. One of the younger men, a prospect who had been riding with the chapter for less than a year, crouched down to her eye level. "You doing okay?" he said. Harper looked at him carefully. "Are you one of Kodiak's people?" she said. The prospect glanced up at Kodiak. Kodiak gave a small nod. "Yeah," the prospect said. "I'm one of his people." Harper nodded the nod of someone whose calculation had been confirmed. "Okay," she said. Elliot ended his call. He looked at Ironwall and gave a small, precise nod. "CPS is coming," Ironwall said to Kodiak quietly. "Sheriff's Department, too." Kodiak nodded. Harper looked up at him. "What happens now?" she said. Kodiak looked down at her. He thought about what he wanted to say and what he could honestly say, and he understood the distance between those two things clearly enough not to cross it carelessly. "People whose job is to make sure you're safe are coming," he said. "That's what happens now." Harper looked at him with those green eyes, steady and assessing. "Are you coming back?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "I'm coming back." She looked at him for another moment, weighing it. Then her fingers tightened around the medallion in her hand and she nodded. Outside, the October sun was climbing over the eastern ridge. The convoy of motorcycles gleamed in the driveway. The dust from their arrival was still settling slowly across the desert scrub when the sheriff's cruiser appeared at the end of the dirt road, moving toward the house with its lights on and no siren. Elliot Branson stood beside Ironwall on the porch. "CPS is going to take her today," Elliot said quietly. "That's not going to be negotiable." "I know," Ironwall said. "And we won't be on the approved placement list," Elliot said. "Not automatically, not any of us." Ironwall watched the sheriff's cruiser coming up the road. "Then we get on the list," he said. Elliot was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be a fight," he said. "Yes," Ironwall said. "It is." The CPS worker arrived 20 minutes after the sheriff. She was a woman named Deborah Fitch, who had worked San Bernardino County for 16 years and who walked through the ruined doorway of Marge Stokes's farmhouse with the careful attention of someone reading a complicated document, taking in everything the room contained without visibly reacting to any of it. She spoke to Harper alone in the kitchen for 12 minutes. When she came out, she moved directly to Elliot Branson, and what she said to him was quiet enough that only Ironwall standing nearby caught it. "She's coming with me today," Deborah Fitch said. "That part isn't negotiable, but I've been doing this work for 16 years, and I want you to understand something." She looked at Elliot directly. "Whatever that child told me in that kitchen, she is not alone. I'm going to make sure everyone who touches this file understands that clearly." Elliot looked at her. "Thank you," he said. Deborah Fitch went to find Harper. Harper came out of the kitchen and walked to where Kodiak stood by the doorway. She looked up at him. She held out the medallion. "Take it," she said. "So you have to come back for it." Kodiak looked at the silver in her palm. He felt something move in his chest, something that had been still for 5 years, beginning very slowly to shift. He took the medallion. He held it in his fingers for a moment. Then he placed it carefully back in her hand and closed her fingers around it. "I'm coming back," he said. "I don't need a reason for that." Harper looked at him. Then she turned and walked with Deborah Fitch toward the county vehicle, her bare feet on the gravel drive. Her hand closed around the silver, her back straight. She did not look back. Kodiak stood in the ruined doorway and watched the vehicle back down the drive and turn onto the highway and move away until it was gone. He stood there a moment longer with his hand on the doorframe. Behind him, Ironwall said nothing. Around him, 40 men were quiet. Kodiak turned and looked at Elliot Branson. "Tell me what we have to do," he said. Elliot opened his phone. "It's going to take time," he said. "Money, in the cleanest version of every background in this building." "Tell me what we have to do," Kodiak said again. Elliot looked at him. He looked at Ironwall. "First," he said, "we're going to need a judge." The first hearing was on a Thursday in November, 3 weeks after the morning the desert dust had settled over Marge Stokes's driveway, and a county vehicle had carried Harper Wren away down Highway 15. Elliot Branson came to court with a leather briefcase containing 412 pages of documentation assembled over the preceding 21 days. Financial records for the chapter's legitimate automotive businesses, which were several and profitable, and operated in full compliance with applicable law. Tax returns going back 7 years. Property deeds. Character references from a city councilman, 2 business owners, and a retired San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputy who had known Raymond Coulter for 30 years and had agreed without much persuasion to put his assessment in writing. The judge assigned to the case was Garrett Wills. He was 61 years old, appointed to the San Bernardino County bench in 1989, and he had grown up in a suburb outside Chicago, in a household where the television coverage of outlaw motorcycle culture in the 1960s had settled into a set of assumptions he had never subsequently found reason to question. He wore reading glasses on a chain and had a quality of settled conviction that Elliot recognized immediately as the most difficult kind of obstacle, not the conviction of a corrupt man or a careless one, but of a man who genuinely believed his judgments were sound. Elliot presented the case for emergency foster placement with Lorraine and Raymond Coulter. Garrett Wills listened carefully. He asked precise questions. He reviewed the submitted documentation with the attention of a man who understood his responsibilities. Then he set his reading glasses down and looked at Elliot directly. "Mr. Branson, I appreciate the thoroughness here, but I want to be direct with you from the beginning. I'm not going to place a child who has already suffered significant trauma into a household connected to an outlaw motorcycle club. Not on an emergency basis, and not on any other basis pending a full review." He paused. "That is my position, and I want you to have it clearly." Elliot said, "Your Honor, the Coulters have no criminal record. Their home has passed inspection. Their finances are sound. The connection you're referencing is a social one, not a legal one." "It is considerably more than a social connection," Will said, and his voice was not unkind, which was in its own way harder to work against than if it had been. "We'll schedule a full hearing for January. Harper Wren will remain in county care in the interim." Elliot drove back to San Bernardino in the gray November afternoon and sat in the clubhouse and told Ironwall and Kodiak what the judge had said. Kodiak listened without moving. When Elliot finished, he said, "January." "January 14th, Elliot said. Kodiak said nothing further. Harper Wren spent November and December in a county group home in Rialto, a flat-roof building on a flat street with a chain-link fence enclosing a concrete yard. It was not Marge Stokes's basement. The building was clean, the heat worked, the meals arrived at predictable times, and no one struck her or locked her in the dark. Measured against her recent history, it was an objective improvement. But what defined those weeks for Harper was not the physical conditions of the group home. It was the composition notebook she requested on her third day there, and the specific way she filled it. Not with the processing of a traumatized child working through her experience, though her caseworker, a young woman named Pam, would have recognized and welcomed that. Harper filled her notebook with information. She asked Pam questions about how courts function, about what judges did and how they decided things, about what the terms emergency placement and permanent custody and best interest of the child meant in the specific legal sense. She asked with the systematic patience she brought to everything she wanted to understand, building a picture, one accurate piece at a time. She also wrote a letter. She wrote it on a Tuesday evening in December at the common room table while the other children watched television. She used 3 pages of her notebook, wrote them through, and tore them out. Then she started again on a fresh page, writing more slowly, choosing each word with the care she gave to things she considered important. When she was finished, she had 1 page. She read it through twice. She folded it into thirds and asked Pam the following morning whether she could mail a letter. Pam said yes and provided an envelope and stamp, and asked with the gentle professional curiosity of her training who Harper was writing to. Harper told her. Pam was quiet for a moment. Then she helped Harper address the envelope. The letter arrived in Garrett Wills's chambers on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December. His clerk noted that it appeared handwritten and was addressed to the judge personally rather than to the court. Garrett Wills set it aside and worked through his morning docket and came back to it at 11:15 with coffee. He opened it and read it. The handwriting was a child's, careful and slightly uneven, the letters formed with visible deliberateness. The spelling was mostly correct. The sentences were short and wasted nothing. It said, "Dear Judge Wills, my name is Harper Wren. I am 8 years old. I am the girl you are making a decision about. I wanted to write to you because I think you should know something about the night in the desert. When I was in the basement, I could hear people upstairs looking for me. I did not know if Kodiak was alive. I did not know if anyone was coming. But I knew that if he was alive, he had my address in his pocket because I put it there. I put it there because I was alone and I wanted to leave a door open. That is what I have always had to do. Leave doors open because no one opened them for me. Kodiak opened the door. He drove through the desert with bullets in him to open a door I had left open for him. I have been in 4 foster homes. No one ever came back for me before. I do not know what the right legal decision is, but I wanted you to know that. Sincerely, Harper Wren. Garrett Wills read the letter twice. Then he set it on his desk and took his reading glasses off and sat looking at the window for a long time. The January 14th hearing was the second. Elliot presented an expanded record. Lorraine Coulter testified, and she was not what Garrett Wills had expected, which was perhaps what Elliot had understood when he put her on the stand first. She was 50 years old, a high school English teacher for 22 years, a woman who spoke about children and learning with a warmth and precision that could not be performed. She answered every question directly. She did not deflect the questions about her husband's associations. She said simply and without defensiveness that she had been married to Raymond Coulter for 27 years and that she knew exactly who he was, and that what she had observed across those 27 years was a man who kept his word in all circumstances. Ironwall testified. He wore a jacket and tie which was, by the collective memory of everyone in the chapter, unprecedented. He answered Garrett Wills's direct and sometimes pointed questions with the same steady calm he brought to everything. He did not soften his history. He did not apologize for what he was. When Wills asked him directly why he believed he and his wife were appropriate guardians for this child, Ironwall said, "Because she saved one of my brother's lives, and she is 8 years old, and she has been alone since she was 5, and I do not leave people behind." Garrett Wills looked at him for a long time. Then he said he would take the matter under advisement and issue a decision within 2 weeks. In the courthouse hallway, Kodiak stood with his arms crossed and waited for Elliot. Elliot came out and said, "He's wavering." "That's not yes," Kodiak said. "No," Elliot said. "It's not." The decision came in 9 days. Garrett Wills denied the placement. His written ruling was 4 pages and was careful and cited appropriate case law, and was the work of a man who believed he was doing right by the child. But the conclusion was the same. He was not prepared to place Harper Wren with any household directly connected to the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. He proposed 2 alternative approved families in San Bernardino County. Elliot read the ruling in his office and called Ironwall. There was a silence on the line. "Third hearing," Ironwall said. "March," Elliot said. "We appeal and go back in March." "How is she?" Ironwall said. Elliot had spoken to Pam the day before. "She's okay," filling notebooks, asking about the case. Ironwall said, "She asks about Kodiak." Not a question. "Yes," Elliot said. What Elliot did not say, because he was still working through its implications, was what Pam had mentioned almost in passing at the end of their conversation, the way significant things were sometimes revealed when people believed the important part of the conversation had already concluded. Pam had mentioned that Harper had written a letter to the judge in December. She mentioned it with the slightly uncertain quality of someone who was not entirely sure she had done the right thing in facilitating it. Elliot had asked what the letter said. Pam told him what she remembered. Elliot had sat with that for 2 days. Then he called Garrett Wills's clerk and made a specific and unusual request, and 3 days later the clerk called back and said the judge would see him. Elliot Branson sat across from Garrett Wills in his chambers on a Friday afternoon in February, and they talked for 40 minutes. It was not a conversation that would appear in any record. At the end of it, Wills picked up a piece of paper from his desk, where it had apparently remained since December, and held it in both hands. "I've been doing this work for 22 years, he said. "Parents write to me. Lawyers write to me. Children occasionally write to me asking for things." He looked at the page. "I have never had a child write to me simply to make sure I understood a situation accurately, without asking for anything specific, just to make sure I knew." Elliot said nothing. "She's 8 years old," Will said. "Yes," Elliot said. Will set the letter down. "The March hearing. I want her present. I want to speak with her directly in chambers, not the courtroom." He paused. "That's irregular, and I'm aware of it." "I understand," Elliot said. I want her answers to be her own, Will said. Not prepared, not rehearsed. I understand, Elliot said again. On the morning of March 9th, 1999, Harper Wren put on the clothes she considered her best, a pair of dark jeans and a green sweater that Lorraine Coulter had sent to the group home through Elliot at Christmas, with a card that said only for whenever you need them. She brushed her hair carefully. She ate breakfast. She was quiet in the car with Pam watching the desert pass outside the window. The flat, pale landscape she had looked at her entire life, in which she knew the way, things that have always simply been there. In the marble hallway outside Garrett Will's chambers, she saw Kodiak. He was standing with Ironwall and Elliot and Lorraine, and he was wearing a clean flannel shirt with his cut over it, the winged skull across his back, the San Bernardino rocker beneath it, and he was holding his hat in his hands, in the careful, uncertain way that very large men sometimes hold hats in formal situations. He saw her the same moment she saw him. Harper crossed the hallway and stood in front of him. He looked down. She looked up. She reached into the pocket of her jeans and took out the medallion and held it up between them. I've been keeping it, she said. I know, he said. How are you doing? She considered the question with the seriousness she gave to all questions worth answering. I'm okay, she said. I've been learning how courts work. Something moved across his face. Yeah. It's complicated, she said, but it makes sense if you pay attention to it. Most things do, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she put the medallion back in her pocket. I wrote a letter, she said, to the judge, back in December. Kodiak went still. What did it say? Harper looked at the door to the chambers. That you came back, she said. That you came back when you didn't have to. Kodiak was quiet for a long time. Pam touched Harper's shoulder gently and said the judge was ready. Harper walked to the chamber door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at Kodiak one more time. He was watching her with those dark eyes, the mountain of a man holding his hat in his hands, in the marble hallway, and his face held the expression she had not had a word for when she first saw it in the ditch in the dark. She had found the word since in a dictionary at the group home, because she looked up everything she encountered that she did not yet fully understand. Undone. She nodded at him once, the decisive nod she used when she had made a decision and was ready to act on it. Then she went through the door. Garrett Wills's chambers were smaller than she had imagined from Elliot's descriptions. Books covered 2 full walls, floor to ceiling, and the desk was large and dark and covered in papers, organized in the controlled disorder of someone who worked in productive chaos. He was older than she'd pictured, with gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and he stood up when she came in. Adults rarely stood up for children. She noted it. He asked her to sit. He asked if she wanted water. He asked Pam to wait in the hallway. Then he arranged 2 chairs facing each other, no desk between them, and sat across from her. Harper, he said, I received your letter. I know, she said. Your clerk sent a note acknowledging it. He looked at her. Did you mean what you wrote? She thought about this carefully before answering. I always mean what I write, she said. I don't put things on paper that I don't mean. He was quiet for a moment. I want to ask you some questions. There are no correct answers. I just want to understand what you think. Is that all right? Yes, she said. He asked her about the night in the desert. He asked what she had been thinking when she went out of the barn. She told him she had heard a sound like an animal caught in something, and that she could not stay still when something was hurting if she was in a position to do something about it. He asked if she had been afraid. She said yes. He asked why she went anyway. She thought about it and said that she believed being afraid and going anyway was probably the only mechanism by which anything difficult ever got done. He was quiet after that response for a beat longer than he had been after the others. He asked about the medallion, why she had kept it. She said because she said she would and she kept her word. He asked if she had believed the man who gave it to her would return. She said she had believed he would because he had a code, and the code appeared to matter to him more than most things, and that in her experience, People with codes were the most reliable kind of people, even when the codes were different from the ones most people expected. He asked how she had come to understand that. She said she had been watching people for her entire life because watching carefully was the most useful thing she had figured out how to do, and that the people with internal codes were consistently the ones who came through. Garrett Wills looked at her for a long time. "Harper," he said, "if I asked you where you wanted to be, what would you tell me?" She had thought about this question many times, in the group home and in the dark and in the spaces between everything else. She had constructed the honest answer carefully. "With Lorraine and Mr. Coulter," she said, "and with Kodiak." She paused. "I know that's complicated. I know there are reasons it's complicated, but you said there were no correct answers." She looked at him steadily, her hands folded in her lap over the outline of the medallion in her pocket. "I know what it feels like when nobody comes. I know what the dark room is. I know what it means to put an address in someone's pocket because that's the only door you can leave open." She stopped. He came. He came through the desert hurt, and he kicked the door open. "I don't know all of what your rules say about who should take care of children, but I know what it means when someone kicks the door open, and I know it doesn't happen often, and I know what it meant when it happened to me." The chambers were very quiet. "I know I'm 8, she said. "I understand that I'm not the one who decides this, but you asked." Garrett Wills took his reading glasses off and set them on his knee. He looked at the girl in the green sweater sitting across from him, 8 years old. Desert green eyes, the outline of something in her pocket, her hands folded and her back straight, and her gaze entirely steady. He sat with that for a long time. The 2 weeks that followed involved phone calls between Garrett Wills and the County Director of Child Services that Elliot Branson was not party to. A home visit to the Coulter residence conducted by a senior CPS evaluator rather than a standard caseworker. A second review of Ironwall's business records more thorough than the first. And several evenings in which Garrett Wills sat alone in his chambers, reading and rereading 4 short paragraphs written in a child's careful hand. On March 23, 1999, Garrett Wills issued his decision. He approved foster placement of Harper Wren with Lorraine and Raymond Coulter of San Bernardino, California, subject to a supervision arrangement with quarterly CPS review for 1 year. Attached to the decision was a 2-paragraph note unusual enough that Elliot Branson read it 3 times to be certain he understood it correctly. The note said that the court found the Coulter household to offer a stable and demonstrably committed environment. It said the court was persuaded in part by the testimony and direct communication of the child herself, who had demonstrated a quality of judgment and character that the court found compelling. It said the court expected its supervision conditions to be met with the same seriousness the Coulter family had brought to every stage of this proceeding. The note said nothing about the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club by name. It said that sometimes a door being kicked open was the beginning of something rather than its end. Elliot read the last line twice. Then he called Ironwall. Ironwall listened to the entire decision without speaking. When Elliot finished, there was a silence. "Tell Kodiak," Ironwall said. Elliot called Kodiak and read the decision from beginning to end. When he finished, there was a different kind of silence. "When does she come home?" Kodiak said. "They're processing the paperwork this week, probably the first week of April." A silence. "Elliot," Kodiak said, "that note at the end, about the door." "Yes," Elliot said. "She wrote him a letter," Kodiak said. Not a question. He had known since March 9th, since she told him in the hallway, but hearing it now in the context of the ruling was a different thing. "Yes," Elliot said. 8 years old," Kodiak said. "Yes," Elliot said. The line was quiet. "All right," Kodiak said. "Okay." Harper Wren arrived at the Coulter house on a Saturday morning in early April, on a day of high blue desert sky and warm moving wind, the kind of spring morning the Mojave produced occasionally, as if to demonstrate that it was capable of something other than severity. Lorraine Coulter had made breakfast and put a glass of wildflowers from the backyard on the kitchen table. Ironwall stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, and watched the county vehicle come down the road. Kodiak was not there that morning. This was intentional and understood. The supervision conditions required a certain shape to the early period, and Kodiak had understood without needing it, explained at length. He would not be a formal presence or a daily one. He would be the man who came to the garage on Saturdays, the friend of the family, and he and Harper would build what they were going to build in the space that was available, which was not the space he might have designed, but which was the space that existed. He was parked at the end of the road when the county vehicle arrived. He watched from a distance as Lorraine came off the porch and opened the car door. He watched Harper get out small in jeans and the green sweater holding a backpack and a composition notebook under her arm. He watched Harper look at the house, look at Lorraine, say something he was too far away to hear. Watch Lorraine laugh and put her arm around the child's shoulders. Watch them go inside together. He sat in the truck with the engine off and the morning sun coming through the windshield. He took the charter medallion from his jacket pocket and turned it once in his fingers. The familiar weight of it, the raised detail of the wing skull. Then he put the truck in gear and drove to the garage. The first Saturday he came to the Coulter house. Harper was in the front yard with a book open in her lap. She looked up when his truck turned in, watched him park and get out, then closed the book and came across the yard and stood in front of him. "You're here," she said. "Said I would be," he said. She looked at him with those steady green eyes. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." The garage at the back of the Coulter property was a working space concrete floor and high steel shelving and a hydraulic lift that Ironwall used for the bikes, and that served as the mechanical center of the household's practical life. It smelled of motor oil and metal and rubber, and the light through the high windows was the clear functional light of a space where things were built and fixed and understood. This was where Kodiak came on Saturdays. This was where Harper came too not long after. She did not come to watch. She came to learn, and Kodiak recognized the difference immediately. The distinction between someone who wanted to observe and someone who wanted to understand. He taught the way he did most things directly and without decoration. How an engine worked, what each tool was for and the logic behind it. The names of parts and why they had the names they did, which often reflected something true about their function. Harper listened and then asked questions, and the questions were consistently better than he expected, reaching past the surface of what he'd said to the principal that organized it, and he answered them with the same quality of attention he would have given to anyone he respected. She was 9 that summer, 10 the following October, which fell on a Saturday, and Lorraine made a cake and the entire chapter showed up uninvited and ate most of it and left the kitchen in a state that Lorraine addressed with the patient amusement she applied to most things the Brotherhood did in her house. Harper grew in the accelerated way of children who have been inadequately fed and then aren't the body and mind arriving together at the place they had been aimed all along. She filled notebooks continuously. She read everything available to her and requested what wasn't. She was, Lorraine told Kodiak one afternoon while they stood in the garage doorway watching Harper lie on a mechanic's creeper under the frame of Ironwall's Road King, working at something with focused concentration, quite possibly the sharpest student she had encountered in 22 years of teaching English, and she said this without exaggeration. Kodiak looked at the pair of feet visible below the frame of the Road King, small still in the oversized work gloves, moving with the purposeful confidence of someone who knew what they were reaching for. "Yeah," he said. "I know." Harper came out from under the frame with grease on her forearms and the carburetor in her hands intact and removed clean. She held it up for inspection. "Did I do it right?" she said. Kodiak took it from her and turned it in his hands. Examined the connections. Set it on the workbench and looked at how she'd positioned the removed parts in sequence so reassembly would follow a clear logic. He looked at her. He nodded once. Harper's expression did not change dramatically, but something settled in it, some small internal thing resolving into place. She had learned over the Saturdays in the garage that Kodiak did not give praise casually and that a single nod meant more than a paragraph from someone else. She filed the nod and went back under the frame. Lorraine caught Kodiak's eye from the doorway. She raised her eyebrows slightly. He looked away first. The October 1999 final review was the last formal proceeding. Elliot submitted a supervision period report that was thorough and unambiguous in its conclusions. The senior CPS evaluator submitted a separate report finding the child thriving, the placement stable, the household environment unusually rich in both emotional support and intellectual engagement, and recommending permanent placement without reservation. Garrett Wills granted the adoption. Elliot drove to the Coulter house that afternoon and told them in the kitchen, all of them at the table together, Lorraine and Ironwall and Harper and Kodiak, who happened to be there because he was there most Saturdays by that point. What happened in the kitchen in the late October afternoon was not dramatic in the way movies made important things dramatic. Lorraine put her hand over her mouth for a moment and looked at the ceiling. Ironwall nodded once the way he concluded things. Kodiak, who was sitting across from Harper, looked at her. Harper looked back at him. She reached into the pocket of her jeans. She set the medallion on the table between them and pushed it across to him. "You should have it back now," she said. "For real this time." Kodiak looked at the silver on the table. He looked at her face. He picked it up and turned it once in his fingers, the familiar weight of it, the raised detail he could trace in his sleep. Then he set it back on the table and slid it across to her. "When you ride your own," he said, "you earn your own." Harper looked at him. She picked up the medallion and held it, feeling the weight of it, the way she had felt it in the dark in the basement, when it was the only solid thing in the world available to her. She looked at the winged skull, the charter name, the details she had memorized across many months of holding it. "Okay," she said. The years that followed moved the way years move when they are filled rather than empty, with a speed that was really just arrival time catching up with itself. Harper grew. The garage on Saturdays became the architecture of the weeks. The brotherhood that gathered at the Coulter house on weekends and at the clubhouse on holidays became the texture of the life she was building. These large and complicated and loyal men and the women who moved among them. A world entirely unlike any world her classmates at school inhabited, and about which she felt no impulse to pretend otherwise. She was 12 when Ironwall let her sit on the Road King in the driveway for the first time, engine off, to understand the geometry and the weight of it. She was 13 the afternoon she cracked the carburetor on a 1979 Shovelhead, alone in the garage while Kodiak was out on a run and had it cleaned and reassembled before he returned. He came in and saw the bike, and saw the parts arranged in order, and saw her hands, and didn't say anything for a moment. "Did anything break?" he said. "No," she said. He hung up his cut and picked up a wrench and went to work on something else. That was enough. She was 14 when she rode the Road King slowly around the perimeter of the property, with Kodiak walking alongside, his hand near, but not on the grips, watching her weight distribution and her throttle control with the focused assessment he brought to anything mechanical. She was 16 when she rode alone for the first time on the empty road behind the house, opening the throttle on a long empty straight and coming back with desert dust in her hair and something in her face that Kodiak recognized because he had seen it once in a mirror a long time ago on a different face. The look of someone arriving somewhere. She saved money with the systematic patience she applied to everything she decided mattered. 2 jobs the summer before her senior year, every dollar tracked in a notebook. She found the Sportster through a charter contact, a 1992 model in pieces, in a garage in Fontana, priced accordingly. She negotiated without assistance and paid in cash and trailered it home and spent the following winter taking it apart and putting it back together better than it had been in the Coulter garage. Kodiak came by most Saturdays and sat on the rolling stool and occasionally said something useful and was otherwise quiet, which was the form of company she had always found most comfortable. The chrome she polished herself, the engine she rebuilt herself, the seat she had custom fitted by a woman in Riverside who did leather work for several of the charters and who did not ask questions and produced exactly what was specified. She painted it silver. She did not explain this to anyone. She did not need to. On the day she registered it and rode it home for the first time on public roads, she went to her room and opened the drawer beside her bed where the medallion had lived since the adoption. She held it for a moment, turning it over once, looking at the winged skull and the charter name she had memorized in a cold basement in the dark when she was 8 years old. Then she put it on, the thick chain around her neck, the silver resting against her sternum exactly where it had rested on the night she had needed it most. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Then she went downstairs. It was a Saturday morning in October of 2008, exactly 10 years after the night the desert bled. The convoy assembled in the Coulter driveway before dawn, the way they assembled when they rode long distances in the darkness before sunrise, the engines speaking one by one and then together. 40 bikes, the same number that had come down the dirt road outside Bastow 10 years before, though not all the same riders, because time changed the composition of things while leaving the essential thing intact. Kodiak was at the front. He had ridden at the front of San Bernardino convoys for decades, and it was where he belonged not by rule, but by the accumulated rightness of things that have been true long enough to simply be true. The bike beside his was silver. It sat low and custom, and it gleamed in the pre-dawn dark with a quiet particular light, and the woman on it sat with the easy, settled confidence of someone who understood completely the machine beneath her and had understood it for years. Ironwall gave the signal from the porch. The engines lifted together from single notes into a chord, into something beyond the category of music, a physical condition of the October morning air. The convoy pulled out of the Coulter driveway and onto the road, and the road gave way to the highway, and the highway opened into the desert, and the desert received them the way it received everything, with ancient indifference and without comment. Kodiak rode. Beside him, the silver Sportster kept pace without effort, the engine tuned to a note she had worked toward across a winter of careful attention, a sound that was entirely its own. The sun came over the eastern ridge and struck the Mojave in a long, flat flood of gold that turned the scrub and the pale sand and the distant formations into something briefly extraordinary, something that looked like the kind of country where things that mattered happened. The light caught the chrome of 40 motorcycles and scattered itself across the desert in bright fragments that traveled faster than the bikes. The woman on the silver Sportster felt the light on her face and the October wind moving through her hair and the familiar weight of the silver against her sternum. And she did not think about the basement or the dark room or the cold dirt floor of a ditch outside Bastow, California. Those things were inside her, the way the desert was inside her foundational real present, not forgotten and not regretted. They had made her what she was, and she had no argument with that. She had stopped waiting to be found a long time ago. She was 18 years old, and she had saved a life in the dark and left a door open, and the door had been walked through, and in the long space between that October night and this one, she had become someone who did not wait for doors to be opened. She had become someone who understood the geometry of locks and the weight of boots and the specific satisfaction of a door giving way to a determined and well-applied force. The convoy rode south through the Mojave, and the desert received the sound of them and let it pass and return to its deep old quiet after they were gone. The wind moved through the creosote and the sage. The light moved across the pale flats in long, slow sheets. Harper Wren rode in the October morning with the convoy around her and the silver medallion warm against her chest and the open desert ahead, and the road reached out in front of her into the vast and indifferent and beautiful Mojave, and she rode toward it without hesitation, the way she had learned to move toward all things that lay ahead of her in the dark.